We're looking today at the origins of the medium of photography. We'll focus on the media of the daguerreotype, the calotype, and the cyanotype, which were all early ways of making photographs from the 1830s to the beginnings of the 1840s. The big picture of what we'll be looking at today, we'll see that the interest in capturing a shadow goes back as far as human history. Several technologies had already been developed for the mechanical recording of vision. By the early 1800s, the last step that was necessary was to get the chemistry together and working properly in order to be able to freeze that image that people could see. The camera obscura is one technology that we'll look at. In the 1830s, there were two technologies that were simultaneously developed for capturing an image, and they were created independently of each other. The daguerreotype was developed in France, and the calotype was developed in Great Britain. Both the daguerreotype and the calotype each had their own benefits and limitations, and both became widespread in their own ways. So long before the beginnings of what we now think of as photography, there were different kinds of methods and devices that were used to take the things that we can see in the world and try to freeze them, to capture a shadow. On the left, you see what we call a camera lucida. This is a device where a lens and a prism are used to sort of project an image down that an artist would trace physically. Or you could go with the more rudimentary method of just projecting a shadow onto a screen and people could trace from that. So those things had been around for a long time. Also around for a long time was the camera obscura. So camera obscura means dark room, and what the dark room is a room with an aperture in it, a little hole, and the world that is illuminated outside of this dark room is sort of projected through this dark hole onto the wall of the inside of that room. Cameras obscura are still made today. People will make them for sort of demonstration purposes. There are really famous ones. For example, there's one in San Francisco. This is a temporary one that was set up in New Jersey. And you'll see that the image that's projected onto the wall in this dark room is upside down because it's sort of flipped by the process of going through that little aperture. So cameras obscura had been made since the Renaissance and most likely earlier than that. But in the times of the Renaissance, they would use them to trace the things that are projected from the outside world onto the wall. But you're limited because that room's got to be pretty big to be able to function. So when they were able to do so, they developed these smaller tabletop cameras obscura that would have a lens and an aperture that could be adjusted, made larger and smaller, to project a miniaturized image onto a surface, and then they could look down through this little window on top of it, and then trace the things that they could see on that surface inside there. The camera obscura was designed to function basically like an eyeball does, with an aperture, a little hole that light comes in through, and that aperture can be opened and closed the way that the iris in our eyes opens wider and closes down smaller to adjust to the light that's going on in the outside world. So this brings us to the daguerreotype because it was the chemistry that was still missing to be able to have that projected image just be captured on something and recorded permanently. The daguerreotype was the first patented method to make a permanent static image. So have a look at this image. This was created in 1826. It's very, very dim. This is basically what you would see if you could see this in person. It's in a protected environment now, and they occasionally bring it out for exhibition. But this is what we call a heliograph, very dim, very subtle image. So you can see by this contrast enhanced version of that image that that heliograph captured a very long span of time. You can tell that by looking at where the light is illuminating the buildings that you see in this scene. Okay, if you look at the right hand side of the image, you can see the sun is shining on the sides of the building on that side. And if you look at the left hand side of the image, you can see the sun is shining on buildings on that side. And that's because this exposure was so long that the sun was traveling across the top of the sky. This exposure took a period of hours, and then the image itself is subtle and somewhat fugitive. By fugitive, we mean that more light would make this image fade more and more. So it's a highly protected image. But this was made in 1826 by Nietzsche. So Daguerre built on Nietzsche's technology. The two of them collaborated, and then Daguerre took that technology and ran with it. Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre was a successful diorama artist. Prior to being what we call a photographer, he already made art that people could see and sort of be absorbed in. So he built on research by Nietzsche, whose view from the window at Le Gras we just looked at. It was a fairly stable, direct positive image. Definitely had its problems, but he built on the technology that Nietzsche had developed. The daguerreotype involves a polished copper plate that is prepared with silver and iodine, and it's treated with mercury, fumes, and heat. It's a technically demanding, complex, and highly toxic process. The resulting image has a mirrored effect, and it is a unique image. It cannot be reproduced. You can take, these days, you can take a picture of a daguerreotype, but when the daguerreotypes were first made, that daguerreotype is one thing, and it's always going to be just like that. You want another daguerreotype, you got to start all over again by taking a new picture, and that picture is going to be a new, unique image. The French government purchased the patent for the daguerreotype in 1839. So prior to making daguerreotypes, Daguerre was already a showman. He made he made panoramas. Here's an example of a panorama from Daguerre's time. It's made to be seen in a sort of a 360-degree view. People would purchase tickets to go and be able to just sort of like take in the spectacle of this painting that just like takes them away to another place. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, you may have seen a famous diorama, the Gettysburg diorama, which depicts a number of scenes from the Battle of Gettysburg sort of composited together. You stand on a platform, sort of walk around and take in the view of this painting. So Daguerre worked in the business of dioramas like those. He also made dioramas like these that are scrolling images. So somebody's behind a screen with a crank, and that image just scrolls by, and people are seated in front of it watching this image go by while there's a narrator who's sort of describing what you can see. So this is a predecessor to the movies. There was no such thing as movies yet, but people could sometimes go to a scrolling painting diorama. That's the business that Daguerre was in. He was there to entertain people with images prior to developing the technology of the daguerreotype. So here's an example of an early daguerreotype. Now this one is from 1837. It was before he had all the technology down just right to be able to patent it, but this image still exists in a highly protected form. You can see that it is a photograph of things that are sitting still. The exposure time takes a long time. So photographing things that are not going to move is kind of that's a limitation that they had at that time. So this is a view of Daguerre's studio. Here's another photograph by Daguerre, a daguerreotype of fossils in his studio. Gives you a little bit of a sense of the early photograph connecting to the passage of time and the sort of freezing of time. This is Daguerre's most famous image. It was made in 1839, and it's the first existent photograph that includes human beings. So this is a long exposure. Daguerre photographed this view outside of his studio window. Was made during the same year that he had patented the technology of the daguerreotype. Exactly how long the exposure time was for this daguerreotype, it's somewhere upwards of 10 minutes. You get a little bit of a sense of just how long the exposure time was by realizing that you can only see a couple of people on this street. This was a busy Parisian street, and in real life, in the middle of the day with the sun out like it was on this day, people would have been walking up and down the sidewalks. There would have been horses and carriages going up and down the street. But because the exposure time was so long, the only people that you see in the image are the ones that are standing still for long enough for their image to register. If you look carefully, you can see them in the lower left-hand quadrant of the photograph. There's a man standing having his boots polished. Here are a few close-up views of that daguerreotype. Um, On the left, you see the image of the man having his boots shined and the person doing the shining. If you look through the image, and there's a link that'll be in our Blackboard site where you can go to scrutinize it on your own. If you look closely, you can see some other areas of the image where you see these sort of blurred shadows that look like they might be people. It's very hard to make out. But because the daguerreotype because of the nature of the way the daguerreotypes are made, the detail is just incredibly precise and very, very tiny. When they had that focus very, very sharp, as it was when Daguerre made this one, that detail just goes on and on and on, and you could scrutinize it with a microscope and still be finding more detail in there. Here are some more close-ups that include what some people have identified as a child and a dog, some images of other people on the street, some shady images passing by, and some other details that you can see in the image. So this one photograph in the form of the daguerreotype was made in 1839 and was the first instance of capturing movement of human beings, and even that very first photograph, it captured reality, but it captured it in a way that you could say that it's not true, because what you're seeing in the photograph is not true to what you would have seen in real life. In real life, you would have seen people walking up and down the street. The photograph gives us an image of a street with no people on it.